you go. Now
It's
we
not
see
the right
you.
camera, but it'll do.
All right. Terrific. Okay, so everybody, welcome. It's now 7:01, and we are so pleased that you're joining us on Tips for High Conflict Co-Parenting. I'm Debra Whitson. I'm the CEO and founder of Whitson Law Firm in Elizabethtown, New York, as well as the CEO and founder of Mediated Online Solutions, which is a virtual mediation service that we operate out of New York State, but we serve our clients anywhere we find them. So tonight we are so excited to address this topic that I know I get tons of questions about all of the time, and we have the preeminent expert on managing high conflict individuals, especially as you're going through divorce or separation or custody situations, and then in the co-parenting following your breakup if you have kids with a high conflict person. So with us tonight, I am so happy to welcome Bill Eddy. He is a licensed certified social worker and an attorney and a therapist and a mediator and an author, and he knows everything there is to know at this point about dealing with high conflict personalities, because he actually developed the high conflict personality theory. And that is used to explain the driving forces behind people who present the most challenging behaviors. And tonight, he's going to answer the questions submitted by our audience viewers, provide you some additional tips and tricks on how to manage these situations, how to get through the co-parenting, and maybe be even effective at it while not losing your mind or losing your cool with the high conflict person, which is really challenging sometimes, but very important. So I want to tell you that Bill has all sorts of credentials and everything, but he'll share more with you. But I wanted to highlight that he's the author of a number of books that are well respected and authoritative on this issue. But for purposes of our subject matter, you're going to want to check out his titles like Mediating High Conflict Disputes, Splitting, Protecting Yourself While Divorcing Somebody with Borderline or Narcissistic Personality Disorder. We hear that a lot. Don't Alienate the Kids. That's an excellent title and an excellent resource. BIF for co-parents. We're going to hear more about what BIF means. And then his most recent book on the related topic that we're covering tonight is Calming Upset People with EAR. And I think Bill will have a chance to describe what that book is all about as well. So Bill, welcome.
Thanks so much, Deborah. I'm glad to be on, and I understand you also have a new book out. And I think it's Divorce Like a Pro, so we're both a little bookish tonight.
We are. Thank you for mentioning that. I really appreciate that. But I want to dive in because the audience has submitted in advance a bunch of questions. So are you ready?
Oh, yes.
Okay, here we go. So first question up is, what motivated you to find better ways to interact with high conflict individuals? And do you see a pattern between certain personality types?
Yes. So I was a therapist, a clinical social worker, licensed clinical social worker for a dozen years. And I really saw a lot of conflicts that I thought could be resolved outside of therapy, like in mediation or court. And I really liked mediation, which I know you do. And I decided to go to law school primarily to practice mediation. But I realized I should practice in court for a couple of years. And when I went to court, what I realized is I was dealing with very similar people as when I was doing counseling, but no one recognized that. And they called them high conflict families. And I said, well, it isn't the whole family. There's a high conflict individual, maybe two sometimes, but don't say it's a family. There's one person with high conflict behavior. So that's kind of how I got into that, was realizing this connection. And that's the high conflict personality theory, is high conflict behaviors related to really mental health issues that aren't being addressed.
Excellent. So I know there's a lot of buzz about narcissists and being in a relationship with a narcissist and breaking up from a relationship with a narcissist, but you've identified a number of different personality types. And I'd like you to go over that and some of the differences briefly and tell us, does it matter if somebody has been clinically diagnosed and meets the diagnostic criteria to have them fall within the ambit of being high conflict?
No, not at all. What's important isn't a diagnosis, it's to recognize a pattern of behavior, which may be more or less severe, so that you adapt what you do to be effective with that pattern of behavior. So, for example, with narcissists, there's certain things you want to do to not be, escalating the person, and also not unnecessarily feeding conflicts with them. People with borderline personalities, antisocial personalities, histrionic, paranoid personalities, those are the 5 that I see a lot in high conflict divorce and separation cases. But you don't have to have a diagnosis, and frankly, most people don't, because personality disorders are still this thing that people in society don't really quite know what to do with or recognize. So it just helps to think in terms of how am I going to adapt what I do, which I'm sure we'll be talking about.
Sure. But before we figure out ways to adapt, I'd like if you could tell us a little bit more about this high conflict personality theory that you developed and how someone, like a lay person who's in that mix, might identify such a personality when going through co-parenting or divorcing an individual so they know the, signs to look for.
Yes, I like to say there's 4 key signs, and these are all behaviors. So one of them is a preoccupation with blaming others, somebody that denies all responsibility for any part of the problem themselves and puts it all on somebody else, such as their former co-partner, co-parent. So there's blaming others. Then there's a lot of all or nothing thinking, that problems, solutions, etc., they tend to see in these all or nothing terms. A third characteristic is unmanaged emotions, that they often will shock you almost. They'll start yelling or jump up and run out of a room, that the emotions seem to drive them more than most people. And the fourth is extreme behaviors. So you see things like domestic violence or alienating a child against the other parent, or hiding money, or hiding children. So these kinds of behaviors. So if you look at blaming, all or nothing thinking, unmanaged emotions, and extreme behaviors, then you need to think, okay, probable high conflict person, I need to adapt what I do.
Okay. So I know we're talking about people who have, already separated if we're discussing co-parenting perhaps. But for some people, getting out of the relationship isn't that easy. So do you have tips for someone who has to coexist with a high conflict person?
To coexist with a high conflict person, one of the things I would say, and with COVID, a lot of people who wanted to get out felt they couldn't. And that's where that book of mine you mentioned, Calming Upset People with EAR, Empathy, Attention, and Respect, is it really helps to calm people by giving them these ear statements. So, for example, someone who's narcissistic, you want to find something you respect about them. Like, you're so good at fixing things. The oven needs some fixing. Is like, direct the person towards a task to keep them busy so they're not busy blaming you, but give them some respect for that. So if you have to be with that person, ear statements are something that can help. Of course, if it's someone like a domestic violence situation, you really want to see how you can be safe from that person.
Yeah, of course. So how does one protect themselves when they're divorcing a high conflict person, including those who may be violent or become violent under that additional stressor?
Yeah, so there's several things, and I guess the biggest I would give is to read my book, Splitting, because it tells you how to deal with court, how to deal with settling out of court, mediation, etc., what to expect, how to prepare before you leave, before you even announce that you want to separate or divorce. It can be really helpful that way. But in many ways, it's getting support people, getting knowledgeable people, having a lawyer you can at least consult with. More people these days try to go without lawyers. But if you're facing a high conflict case, you really need to talk to a lawyer about the procedures and how to follow that, and ideally have them represent you if you do have big court hearings. But also, I think it helps to have a therapist, someone you can talk to, even if it's occasionally. Um, and of course, working out how to be safe, knowing where to be, where not to be, not to disclose certain things, to have people around you who are supportive without telling you what to do, because that's one thing to watch out. Some people just, want to say, oh, here's what you have to do. And that doesn't really help. You want people that say, I can understand you're going through a lot. Let me know if there's some way I can be helpful.
Gosh, there was so much good advice in there, but one or two things that really jumped out at me is that while it always makes sense if you have the luxury of planning ahead for a divorce or life transition like a separation, that it's really, really more important and valuable if you're breaking up with a high conflict individual. And then also, having a support team around you who understands the situation and may understand that what might work in non-high conflict situations may actually be counterproductive in a high conflict divorce. Is that right?
Yeah. So, some things that people do in ordinary cases is they just talk directly. They talk about the past. They try to give the person insight. They say, I have to tell you how I feel. When you said this, it made me feel this way. With high conflict people, sad to say, you have to forget about four things. One of them is telling how you feel, because that feeds their manipulation of emotions and may escalate their own emotions beyond what they can calm down. And don't try for insight, because high conflict people don't have insight into their own part. So when you try to push that on them, they push back harder that it is all your fault. And don't emphasize the past. Really talk about, let's look at our choices now. Talk about what to do now. Because when you go into the past, high conflict people live in the past. They're always defending and justifying and all of that. And it's a quicksand. You just get sucked into that. To really avoid going for emotions, insight, the past, and also don't tell them you think they're a high conflict person. That's absolutely off the table. That just will make your life so much worse if you tell them that.
So, having heard, just in the 15 minutes or so that we've been talking about how challenging working with high conflict people can be and how unreasonable they can be, I think there's a common perception that mediation isn't going to work in those situations. What do you say to that?
Well, I say that we used to think that, but what we found, somewhat out of necessity, is that mediation in many cases with high conflict people is the better way to go. And what I do is I encourage people to try mediation first, because in mediation, you're not escalating the person. You go to court, you're escalating the person. And then if they lose in court, they have to find a way to get you back. And so it's really too adversarial for high conflict people. They just get stuck in conflict. So in mediation, you can keep things calmer. However, don't assume mediation will work. You need to be prepared to go to court. If it doesn't work, the other person may want you to go too far. And a court, today's courts have had 50 years of no fault divorce to develop standards around. And in many cases, high conflict people want more than the standards. So if you go to court, you're going to get the standards if necessary. But the other thing is, no matter how hard you try to stay out of court, the other person may drag you into court. False allegations, pushing for things that are unreasonable. all of that. So I suggest a two-track approach. Try real hard to settle out of court, but in the back of your mind, always keep records, keep a journal of issues, have a lawyer that's at least consulting available so you can go to court if you have to. So mediation first, but you may have to still go to court.
Those are all great tips. I appreciate you sharing those with our viewers. So I have to give a little plug to your High Conflict Family Law Mediation Institute, or the programs within that institute that are focused on family law mediation, because I am a student of that program. And I found that it was really transformative, not just with high conflict cases, but sometimes cases where people are maybe just ordinary, but extremely intransigent on a certain issue or a number of issues, and maybe they're focused on who hurt whom and who broke up their marriage, or who didn't, who's at fault and who's not. So there's some really useful techniques there. So how does somebody vet a potential mediator for, what should they be asking a mediator if they are in a high conflict relationship and they're considering mediation services?
I think they should ask the mediator if the mediator is comfortable with a case with a high conflict person in it, and if the mediator's had experience dealing with high conflict cases. Because I think those are two important things, because they can really catch mediators by surprise. They can also manipulate mediators who aren't familiar with some of the manipulations. And I just know of many cases where a mediator just really fell into the story that I call it the bully story, that the bully told, and the mediator's adopts that as fact and may, have negative glances towards the other person or pressure the other person to be flexible when they really should be setting limits. And so those are things that they need to know and understand.
That makes a lot of sense. So I also hear similar types of observations that you've just made when a mediator may not be attuned to picking up on the dynamic in a high conflict situation with therapists. So do you have any other or different advice when somebody is going to go to counseling or is considering going to counseling with a high conflict romantic partner or intimate partner?
Yeah, I think counselors, frankly, mediators, counselors, lawyers, judges in general are not real attuned to the manipulations of high conflict personalities.
Mm-hmm.
And so it helps actually as a client to educate your counselor and say, you may not be used to dealing with somebody like my husband or my wife or my ex, and I want you to know some things, and to tell them just some basic fundamental tips. Like on the surface, it may look like I'm acting really badly, when in fact that's a projection from the other party onto me, and they're the ones doing those behaviors. And so I caution you not to jump to conclusions and to always ask me questions so that you can work together in the same direction. If a therapist is open, then they may be helpful in understanding the other party. Like you mentioned, a narcissist. If I go to counseling and say, my wife's a narcissist, what should I expect as we go through a divorce? Then a therapist that understands about some of this can say, well, that personality is going to always try to punish you if you expose anything about them that makes them not look superior. Things like that. So it can be helpful. So therapists, it's mixed. Therapists can be actually not helpful or very helpful, depending on what they know. But I find a lot of therapists are open to their client information. And sometimes the client will say, here's a book I'd like you to read. And so sometimes that can prepare the counselor.
So is it really possible to steer a high conflict person towards a problem solving approach to the issues that need to be addressed when you're trying to co-parent with someone?
I think in many cases it is possible, but it needs to have some structure to it. So of course, I recommend that you stick with staying calm, making proposals, writing emails that are brief, informative, friendly, and firm, that you kind of limit what you're trying to do and structure what you're trying to do so that it doesn't just get wild and so they don't get real reactive. You want to be empathetic and respectful without letting them trample on you. So I think it's possible, but it doesn't always happen. But my belief is about 80% of high conflict people can resolve their cases reasonably and can do that out of court if they practice skills of making proposals, communicating, like I said, brief, informative, friendly, and firm. But it often takes the other person doing that. So your co-parent is influenced by what you do. So try to do these things yourself, and they may respond in kind, at least part of the time.
So I find that, the clients who are breaking up from high conflict relationships get very frustrated that they feel under attack and blamed and not heard. And teaching them the BIF method, and I'd like you to spend a couple more minutes on that. I know you've written books on it, entire books, and we can't do justice to it tonight. But how do you get people from, I'm just so frustrated with this high conflict person and how crazy and incensed they make me feel and how I get reactive to it. How on earth could I be calm and give respectful and positive feedback to them and use the BIF method without feeling like I'm the lesser person in the situation,
Right.
because I'm not striking back.
Right. No, this is very important. And in a sense, I want to say something before I say how to do BIF. And that is things to tell yourself. Like, it's not about me. When he says I'm stupid or I'm doing it all wrong, that's because he lacks good problem solving skills. That's not problem solving. That's what I call blame speak. That's the first chapter in the BIF book. And so don't take that in. Don't absorb that. Don't feel like you have to prove that that's not who you are, because it's not who you are. I'm not responsible for his outcome, things like that. So you protect yourself by not taking in some of this stuff. Now, by writing a BIF response, that also is calming because it helps you focus on the straight message. So BIF is brief, like a paragraph, informative, just straight information. Who will do what, where, and when, or information about something. You said that I didn't do something yesterday, but actually I did do it, and it's attached here so you can see this has been taken care of. So it's very, information. Who did what, when, and where. Then it's friendly. So you say, thanks for letting me know your concerns, even though you're seething inside. You want to act as if you're friendly so that it helps keep things calm. And then firm, meaning it ends the hostile conversation. Doesn't mean harsh. It just means, that paragraph takes care of it and doesn't put any hooks out there. Like, don't say, what do you think of that, buddy? That's the kind of thing that escalates people. So that's a BIF response. Now, what I want to tell you is people find it calms themselves to write a BIF response. But we also have gotten feedback that when someone writes using a BIF method to a hostile co-parent, that the hostile co-parent in many cases starts writing back in the same format after a few months. So you may not only calm yourself, but actually calm the other person by using this method as well.
That's what I love about it, is that I'm always telling people, my clients mostly, that you can only control yourself and how you